Hello guys, today we're going to continue our conversion from the man dump truck to a flatbed truck, and in today's video we're going to tidy up the flatbed and make sure it's secured on the truck. We're using a Britain's cane beaver tail low loader for the flatbed on this truck. We just took the beaver tail off it, so as you can see here it's sitting a wee bit too high on the chassis of the truck. And that's because there's a couple of places where the flatbed and the chassis just clashed. We'll need to remove some material to get them to fit together. We need to cut a notch out of the front of the flatbed just so that we can get the truck chassis to fit in there. There's a rail on the side that we need to shorten, or otherwise it's going to be hitting one of the tires. And the leftover piece from the hinge of the beaver tail, we need to cut that off just to get a nice flat finish to our flatbed. So after we do that, the flatbed sits down a lot better on the chassis. The front is kind of level with the cab, looks about the right sort of height, and we're getting it fairly level across the whole length of the truck chassis. The next thing to do would be to paint the flatbed, because the blue looks a bit odd. So I masked it up. I then roughed up the paint that was on it just with the Dremel tool. I mounted it to a block of wood just so that we'd have a stable base to spray it without it falling over. And I just sprayed it with the only can of spray paint I had in the garage, which was a grey, and I think it worked out good enough. Although you will notice a few spots of blue around the edges where the masking tape was, didn't just fully cover them, but I think it's good enough for what I want. Now that we have our flatbed looking a bit better, we need to mount it to the chassis, and there's no natural mounting points on the chassis, so we need to make an adapter or bracket that's going to go between the chassis and the flatbed. So there's two mounting points on the flatbed, and we're just going to make one type of bracket that can fit both mounting points. The easiest thing to do is just 3D print them, so we'll open up Fusion 360 and just design our little bracket. The mounting points are a little offset from the chassis, so they kind of sit below the chassis rails. That means that on our bracket, the mounting point for the flatbed has to be below the top of the chassis rail, so we have to kind of start off under the chassis rail and go up and over it to mount it, because we're going to want to screw into the chassis rails from the outside. And the reason I'm not screwing into the 3D printed part is I think it's going to be a little bit more brittle than the plastic rails that are on the model. So I think we're better off to screw into the injection molded chassis rails of the truck, rather than maybe risk cracking the 3D printed bracket and having to start all over again. Okay, those little supporting pieces just add a little bit more strength around the mounting point on the flatbed, and I just went and printed that twice. So we have one for the front and one for the back. It's exactly the same piece. They're just held in place with a single screw, just the same as it was when it was on the Britain's trailer chassis. It was just mounted at the front and the back. And it will also sit on the truck chassis that will hold it stable, so it's not pivoting around those 2 points. And again, that's the way it was done on the Britain's chassis. The two screws just stopped it coming off the chassis, and then it had points touching the rest of the frame at either side, just to give it an extra bit of support and stop it tilt. Now we can position the flatbed with the new brackets on the truck chassis, and just see that it's lining up pretty perfectly. You can see the support there on the mudguard side, and it's supported on the front at the rail on the chassis as well. The rail on the flatbed and the rail on the chassis are sitting nice and snug on top of each other, so it should be quite stable. Now all that's left to do is mark the points where we're going to drill the mounting holes in the chassis, and we're just going to drill those smaller than the screws that we're actually going to use to mount it, because these are really just guide holes. The screws are going to kind of tap the plastic themselves. That's what we're aiming for anyway. And be very careful not to over tighten the screws, because if you cut the threads out of the holes in the chassis, then you're going to have to redo the brackets again. You're going to have to 3D print them with bigger openings for larger screws. The last feature I want to add to this model is just a clevis hitch for the rear of the model, just so that we can tow whatever sort of trailer or whatever it is we might need to tow behind it. The Scania R620 has a similar sort of idea. Even though it has a fifth wheel, it still has a type of hitch on the back of the truck, so there's no reason why we shouldn't add the same to this. So that was based on the clevis hitch we made for the tractor in the 3D print series, and I just 3D printed one of these. So we line it up with the chassis of the truck, and we'll just mark a couple of positions just for the screws, and again we'll drill through a couple of guide holes for screwing this to the chassis, the same way we did for the flatbed brackets. So there you can see the two marks for the guide holes, so I'll just drill those through, and we'll be able to screw those in just with these little brass screws that I have. And that's it. The truck has now been completely modified. We have the clevis hitch on the back, just mounted into the rear of the chassis. Our flatbed with its new brackets on it. We've the one at the back and another one up the front. They're both screwed into the injection molded chassis rail, like we said, and you can kind of see the screw for mounting it to the flatbed there. So you could cut access to that, but it's easier to just screw into the chassis rail from the sides. We're very close to the end of the build now, so the only thing really left is to add the lights to it. So if you're enjoying the build, don't forget to hit the like button, and if you haven't done so already, make sure and subscribe and get the bell on for notifications. But that's all I have for today, so thanks very much for watching.